Good. Ready to begin. Uh, Today, we're going to talk about Theodore Roosevelt, his presidency, and we're talking specifically on the next few slides about the frontier. What were the conditions out on the frontier? 1890. There's a census is taken every 10 years, and 1890 was one of those years. The director of the Senate announced there are no longer any open available lands in the United States. This is a dozen years before, or 11 years before Teddy Roosevelt takes office. So this is a big change in American history. Frontier has ended. No more open lands that aren't owned by somebody or by the federal government. So the frontier is closed. We're going to look at four major features of this. And out of this closing of the frontier came the tremendous view that Roosevelt had about preserving or conserving certain items in the frontier. 20% of all U.S. woodlands remained in 1890. So during the 1800s, basically, we cut down about 80% of all the forest land in the United States. In Minnesota, 3% of the forest land remained. 97% had been cut down. Second major item, most water rights were now controlled and they were privately owned. So it was just a single individual or farmland owner or some other person that owned all the water rights, or most of the water rights in the United States. Third item of four, in the eastern United States and the southern United States, there'd been people in those areas for, 3 centuries now. And that farmland was getting very depleted, running out of the resources that it needs in order to grow a decent crop. And so farmland is depleted in the east and south. All this land out in the Midwest and toward the West Coast is still usable. And item four, we'd become industrialized. Mining, open pit mining in by digging caves, tunnels, etc. Oil and gas industries, as you see here, the oil industry, I mean, look at that massive amount of towers. And they're operating like crazy and aiding other industrial groups with fuel in particular, or in order to make items, produce items. Summary, 20% of all woodlands remained. Water rights were controlled privately, mostly. East and south farmland is depleted. Mining, oil, and gas industries are operating like crazy. Going to talk about the Turner thesis. We'll relate all of this to Roosevelt in a few minutes, but going to talk about the Turner thesis now, which involves the frontier. Well, who's Turner? Let's take a look. This is Frederick Jackson Turner. He made a speech and later wrote a paper. The speech was called The Significance of the Frontier in American History, and it was delivered at the American Historical Association convention in Chicago in 1893. I've attended, I think, about 5 of these conventions during my working years. Very interesting things. They'd have about 3,000 attendees from around the country. Turner taught at the University of Wisconsin, and that's where he really became famous with this thesis of his about the frontier. And then he moved to Harvard in 1910, retired 1924. Wisconsin regents were critical of Turner and some other professors, saying, "You're doing way too much research and publishing and stuff like that. We want you to be teaching." Another reason he bailed out. Frontier values on the Turner thesis. Turner wrote about 4 values from the frontier. First was aggressiveness out there. People were very protective of land. There was lots of fighting about where's the border, etc. There was violence. You know, it had been more than 50 years since pretty decent revolvers were invented, and lots of innovation, farming equipment, what you grow, etc. And democracy was doing very well out on the frontier. So Turner attempted to answer these questions. Why is it so violent? Why are we so violent? And why do we want less government? Why are there so many people that are opposed to the government interfering in such things as land owning? Less rules, generally, is what they were talking about. Why the violence? Why less rules? And Turner claimed it came from wide open spaces. You feel like you just have everything. This is a gigantic space. Leave us alone. You see this kind of a setting, and you develop values that relate to it. So he's saying the environment can determine values. The paper that he wrote was called The Frontier, and we're going to talk about 4 items from the paper. The frontier broke the bonds of custom. So a wide open frontier, anything goes, rules don't apply, etc. Second item, the frontier offered new experiences. You could think about different things out there, and you could actually do them. And there was no one there to control you from doing them if they thought something was wrong about it. Item 3 of 4, the frontier called out new institutions and activities. So new things started to happen. New institutions were created, according to Turner. And 4th, frontier was a safety valve, such as is kind of pictured here. Pent-up emotions, ambitions. What now will be the release? You know, how do we, I've got all this land. I need to build a house. I need to improve the land. I need to start planting things. And then I get this land free of charge from the federal government. So there's lots of concerns. The Turner thesis, as it applies to the US and Europe, number 1 of 6 items here. There were more Protestants in the United States. The churches were much newer. They were centuries older in Europe. So that was a big difference. Things are new. Things aren't old with super traditions. Number 2 of 6, there's no aristocracy in the United States. By that we mean in Europe, you had dukes and lords and earls and so forth. And however, my concern in the lower left there is I wouldn't bet on this. It's the hierarchy or aristocracy in the United States. Lots of people say it's based on wealth, not titles. Number 3 of 6, there's no kings here. We do have movie stars, however. A lot of people say they fill that role, famous people that we see all the time and buy magazines about them. And there's literally a type of worship of famous people, and that involves movie stars. How are we different from Europe? Keep going. This is 4 of 6. There's no intrusive government here. Governments in Europe are much stronger. A lot of people like this. A lot of people don't like it. We're still seeing this argument in this day and age. And we're being watched more constantly. Majority of surveillance is from corporations. More than half of all the cameras installed in the United States are installed by corporations, or when they group together, they're called trusts by Roosevelt. In 2017, a count was made, and there were 85 million surveillance cameras in the United States. 5 of 6. There's no land-based, or the distribution of land is not based on class. You had lots of the nobility in Europe that owned the land, and then they'd rent it out to farmers who would repay them by giving up 10% of their crop or something like that. Now, in the United States, land ownership became wide-based, according to Turner, due to all this open land and the availability. We'll give you 160 acres, you improve it, it's yours. You don't have to pay for it. So 5 of 6. This is the second part. There's no class-based land distribution. This is a photo of Justin Smith Morrell, the Morrell Land Act, or Morrill Land Act of 1862. So this is 40 years before Roosevelt. But that act of Congress is what said, you can go out to these lands that we've acquired, set yourself up. You have to make certain improvements to the land, and then it's yours. And that was the Morrell Land Act. Item number 6, Turner claims west of the Pecos River, which is pictured here. And you can see it runs through Texas and northward there. And west of that, there's no law enforcement. It's land that was taken from Mexico in the 1840s. There's no marshals out there. Marshals are generally federal sheriffs. So next, Turner thesis. What do the critics say about it? It had no impact on Hispanics, Africans, Asians, or women. It was basically a male-oriented, here's your farm, you can own it. Women can't. We aren't open to blacks or Africans, Asians, Hispanics. Beneficiaries of, according to Turner, or critics of Turner, is that this was all about white males. In your face, Turner. And babies were excluded. Yeah. Relate this to Roosevelt now, this Turner thesis stuff. Roosevelt became very interested in preserving some of the environment in the United States. Second item is he looked outward for new land because land in the US, there wasn't any anymore. So he said, well, we'll expand overseas. This is kind of negatively called imperialism. This is an example of how domestic policies can affect foreign affairs. And Roosevelt wanted to take over lots more land. It may not all be connected as the contiguous United States is till 1960, when we took on Hawaii and Alaska. Famous quote of Roosevelt's, speak softly and carry a big stick. Here's a political cartoon from the age of his presidency, showing him with a massive stick that he's swinging. And on the ground are, over here it says, everything in general. Over here is the railroad trust, the oil trust, etc. So he's taken a club to those who are destroying America. Amazingly, this speech, speak softly and carry a big stick, was delivered at the state fair in Minnesota at the grandstand that still exists. There's a modern image of the grandstand. He delivered the message on the 2nd of September, 1901. This was before he was president. He was vice president at the time. McKinley had not yet been shot. So anyway, famous spot for a due to a very famous speech. The Newlands Reclamation Act of 1902. Now this deals with preservation. This is Francis Newlands. He was a senator from Nevada, relatively new state, and out west where all this open land was located. And his purpose with this Reclamation Act was make the western states bloom. Now we need to talk about what happened in the 1860s concerning this act. This is John Wesley Powell. He was an explorer, and he sailed the Colorado River and just took looks at it and so forth. What's out there? Here's the Colorado River where it runs through the state of Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. Here's New Mexico. Over on the right here of New Mexico is the Pecos River. No law in this area. What needs to be done, he wrote in his diary, his record of the trip, is capture the waters of spring when it's raining like crazy, and then use them all summer. How do you capture these waters? Well, you build dams, and that's what happened along the Colorado River. He also wrote in his diary, going along the Colorado River, he said, this area is unfit for human habitation. Yeah. Now, some of these states out in this area are calling for a water pipeline from Lake Superior out there, so they've got more water. Let's start draining the Great Lakes. So 30 years later, the solution was dams, lots of irrigation systems. There are a total of 15 dams on the Colorado River and over 100 dams on its tributaries. Colorado River is 1,450 miles long, 15 dams. That's a single dam every 96.7 miles. Provisions of the act. First, federal land sales in the West will make profits for the federal government. Federal government controls lots of this land. We're going to sell it to people in light of the Morrill Land Act, where you were given the land if you improved it. Then we'll use the profits from the sales of all that land to reclaim areas by building dams and by irrigating. The image here is an irrigation canal. Number two, Secretary of Interior determines projects out in that area of the west there that have been taken from Mexico. No Asian labor may be used. The reason was past mistreatment of Asians in California in particular. Some people, the critics, say this was due to you have to hire white folks. You can't just hire people who you can pay next to nothing to, pay for their meals and lodging, etc. An 8-hour workday on all projects out in this area, according to the Newlands Reclamation Act. This is pretty historic. Most people were working 10 and 12-hour days. The land that you're on must be 50% of it must be capable of growing products, agricultural products. If not, you don't get any water. You get to use the water that we're building and saving behind these 15 dams along the Colorado River. In order to use that water, you need to be at least 50% agricultural. And finally, item number 6, users cannot sell water on their land to other people. This was never enforced. Lots of corporations came in and took over land and then started selling the water from it, for instance. Newlands Land Act, what were the effects of this? A lot more people headed westward as a result. That all of a sudden it became a place that had water and sounded interesting and needed settlers and had lots of land. And so the settlement of the West increased dramatically, especially wagon trains were used. Even to this late date, there were not cars, trucks, and highways yet. 2 of 6, we're going to build dams. Here's the Colorado River and its tributaries. Each dot is a dam that had been built along the Colorado River and some of its tributaries. Many are not shown here, but these are federal water projects only. There really were about 120 dams altogether. 10 million acres was irrigated as a result of this dam building project. That's about 15,625 square miles, or about 125 by 125 square miles. That's 10 million acres. Of course, this was spread out over the space of half a dozen states, but along the Colorado River, it was a couple of states. So you condense it down, it gives you a sense of what 10 million acres is. So 10 million acres could be irrigated. 60% of all United States vegetables that were grown were now grown in this area. Tremendous increase in vegetables and from within the United States. 25% of all U.S. fruits and nuts were grown out in this area now from New Mexico, Arizona, California. And 58, excuse me, 58 hydroelectric power plants were built. That's 40 billion kilowatt hours of electricity. That's about 1% of all the electricity generated in the United States due to these dams that have been built. Lower left there, 4,178 billion kilowatt hours are the total kilowatt hours today used in the United States, generated nationwide. Hence, 1% of that is what this project of 58 hydroelectric power plants built along the Colorado River led to, was about 1%. The Newlands Reclamation Act, a critique of it. Colorado River dries up as a result of all these dams. You go to the south part of the Colorado River, and this is what it looks like. This is literally a picture of the Colorado River near the Mexican border. The river no longer runs into Mexico. It dries up before it gets there because so much water is being held back by dams for agricultural use in the United States. Large landowners over 160 acres have to pay for water. You got 160 acres, you get water and irrigation free. This was never enforced. There were people that owned thousands of acres, corporations that did, and they used the water free of charge. Side effects. 21 parks were created in 7.5 years out in this area. And this was an effort and an accomplishment of Gifford Pinchot, pictured here, who was the chief forester of the United States. A new cabinet is created by Roosevelt as our next topic. The Department of Commerce and Labor. Today they've been split up and they're two separate departments now. But they contained a group called the Bureau of Corporations, and their job was to stop price fixing and agreements. End these trusts. You get 6 big trusts, and they own 70% of everything within that industry, and they agree with each other about prices, for instance, and competition. And what's amazing about this is no competition, no capitalism. Here you got people that are pretty conservative about capitalism, and yet they're doing everything possible to not make it work. The Elkins Act, 1903, part of the Roosevelt administration. You might remember we talked last week about railroads getting together, and they had people that would ship with them. Many of these people were very large users, small farmers, other people that were just shipping a package. They were nothing in terms of what some big corporation could ship. Now, these big corporations would say, okay, you're charging $3 a mile or whatever the going price was. We want 1/3 of that back. So we'll pay you $3 a mile. Then you send us a check for 1/3 of that back to us. And this was not allowed to small shippers. They didn't get money back. So this law, the Elkins Act, stopped these rebates to large users of railroads. And this involved all railroads, no matter what the size of the railroad was or what the size of the shipping was. The users all have to pay the same price, according to the Elkins Act. Item 2 of the Elkins Act is any rebates that are given after this law takes effect, that's a criminal activity. And it's by the criminal part of it is both for those who give the rebates and those who accept the rebates. The Interstate Commerce Commission was created by this act, and it can investigate all these trusts and corporations about what's happening with rebates. And they can investigate them about anything that might be a contentious issue or an illegal issue, etc. Let's talk about Supreme Court cases. The first case we're going to talk about is the Northern Securities Company versus the United States. The Northern Securities Company was a railroad trust. It was railroads that ran across the northern United States, and they're being sued by the United States government. This is the first antitrust action that was started, and it was in 1901. Railroad companies in the North Pacific, and this applied to the Sherman Antitrust Act, You might remember we talked about that. J.P. Morgan stated to the federal government, if we've done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it. Hee hee. So what are the elements of this act? First, it states that any of this stuff that's going on with your companies, the fact that you've all merged together, that's a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 that we talked about a few minutes ago. Here's John Sherman, who was the senator that instituted this bill that's named for him. And he was a brother to the very famous William Tecumseh Sherman, who was a general during the Civil War. Second of four items, if a company was formed to stop all competition, that can't be done. It stops capitalism. And this isn't commie socialist groups that have been blamed through the McCarthy era and to the present day for violations of capitalism. This is corporations within the United States who are doing this. So the trusts, and their intent is to control all railroad traffic across the United States, and to do it by creating a trust. Here you can see they start in Chicago, go up to St. Paul and Minneapolis, and across very, very near the Canadian border. Then when they get to the West Coast, really span out up to Canada and all the way down to California. And this includes the Great Northern Railway and the famous James J. Hill, whose mansion is part of the Minnesota Historical Society. He paid to build the cathedral on Cathedral Hill there near downtown St. Paul. He was not a Catholic. It's a Catholic cathedral, but his wife was, and she wanted it. So he had that built. And you can go down there and just walk in and see it, look around. And I'm not sure about his house. Used to be tours of it, but I think they've stopped. The trust, a trust in the United States, an agreement between corporations not to compete with each other. This creates a monopoly. A monopoly is anti-capitalist. Swift and Company versus the United States is the next Supreme Court case that we'll talk about. Here's a picture of one of the Swift slaughterhouses companies, known as the Beef Trust. And Swift and several other companies were involved in this agreement. Total of 6 companies, and they controlled a majority of the meat market then in the United States. And they fixed prices on all the meats so that they wouldn't be in competition with each other. They didn't do this legally. They did this all behind the scenes. They did not buy and slaughter meat. Companies had been, okay, we'll buy your cows from you, and then we'll slaughter them. It was all done by one company. Now, in order to increase the price or make it look like an increase in price, you had a company that bought the cattle. Then that company would sell the cattle again to a slaughterhouse, raising the price, supposedly. Raising the price they could charge. Payment for the second sale generally was never made. Or it was refunded. Yeah, we'll give you so much money, but then you give it back to us secretly. And so the double sale, it didn't just appear to increase the price. I mean, it appeared to. It didn't increase the price for the corporations. Higher price to the consumer was the result. That's what the corporations, the meat trust, wanted. So the trust, it blacklisted competitors. They might have controlled like 60% of the market, these big companies. And they would do everything in their power to eliminate the 40% of the smaller competitors within the meat market who were non-trust members, put them out of business. They also required rebates from railroads for the shipping of their meat. Small companies paid a full price to the railroads. Trust companies didn't. They got rebates, higher price to consumers. Problems that Theodore Roosevelt had. Many states thought that these regulations were their right. Federal government shouldn't be doing it. This is a state policy. So stop it. Washington, D.C., federal government. That's what we do, is we're the regulators. Well, the big issue then becomes interstate commerce. What about stuff that travels across 6 states or is sold in a variety of states, etc.? How is that regulated? Conservatives in Congress opposed these regulations. They didn't like it. That's pretty much true to this day. And it's also very much in conflict with the conservative idea of being heavy believers in capitalism. Teddy Roosevelt's answer to all of this was, we need more regulations, and we need to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Commission, who can enforce those regulations. Let's take a look at the Hepburn Act of 1906. This allowed for interstate commerce, for the Interstate Commerce Commission to set maximum rates for railroad shipping and to have no rebates. So they're telling now all these big railroad companies, here's the price you can charge at a maximum. And they're telling both the railroad companies and the people who ship via railroads, you can't get rebates anymore. That's illegal. The feds are now telling how much can be charged for railroad traffic. This is federal government interference, according to conservatives, in maintaining capitalism. Some say no, this is how we will maintain capitalism. Second aspect of the Hepburn Act of 1906, Interstate Commerce Commission is allowed to check the accounting records of all railroads. Make sure that what they're doing is legal. Here's a picture from the Times, these early 1900s, of a room where the accountants work. Accounting records for all railroads are now accessible to the federal government by this law. Oh, let's take a look at Supreme Court cases again. Supreme Court case here. Excuse me. I need to get my clock out where I can see it. Thanks. Supreme Court case. This is Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Texas Pacific Railroad versus the United States. And the decision involved 3 major items. The Interstate Commerce Commission does indeed have the right to look at your records and control what you're doing. It's an implied power, and they can set these rates that you may charge. They can put a maximum and a minimum on them. What's an implied power? It's mentioned in the Constitution. That's why I've got it in quote marks here. Political power granted to the government, but specifically not stated in the Constitution. It doesn't say you can control railroads. There weren't any railroads when the Constitution was written, but there is this implied power or political power that you can do things that aren't stated here in the Constitution. There's another item, this is a part of the first of three, called the elastic clause. Sometimes it's called the necessary and proper clause. And Congress can enact laws to carry out its powers. We have the power to control this and that, and we can pass laws that you have to follow. 1897 decision of the Supreme Court here involves a lot of these items that I'll read to you and sets the stage for what Teddy Roosevelt wants to do. These are called enumerated powers, and they're in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. We can pass a federal budget. We can tax to raise revenues. Now, there was no income tax yet, but they could tax other items, like you buy deodorant and there's a tax on it. They can borrow money. They can coin money. They can declare war. They can maintain an armed force, the federal government can, and can regulate interstate commerce. Those are things that the federal government saw as implied and enumerated powers. 2 of 3, price controls on corporations are just and reasonable, again in quotes. You can do things that are just and reasonable according to the Constitution. Price controls are a just and reasonable thing, according to this decision by the Supreme Court. Railroads must obey these standards or go out of business. Anti-railroad legislation by Theodore Roosevelt. There's 3 elements of it. Further regulations on shipping were done, and greater penalties were added for violations of the laws with anti-railroad legislation. Other legislation or other laws that were passed included the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission. Railroads have to follow the stuff that's been standardized. In this case, the Interstate Commerce Commission said, here's an accounting system and you must use it in the railroads. That way, when they come in and check your accounting system, it's the same everywhere. They know what they're going to see. You can't be doing strange and goofy stuff that they wouldn't understand. So part of the overall legislation during the Roosevelt administration that dealt with railroads involves this standardized accounting system. The number of employees increased 5-fold from 1890 to 1908. So over this 19-year period of time, they went from 104 employees to 527. So a tremendous increase in who was working for them. Legislation, what are the effects of all this stuff? Well, railroad prices began to crumble. They really fell. They couldn't make these massive profits, have these huge agreements. Competition was back, thinking so. By 1950, trucking had replaced railroads. Trucking was not included in any of these laws in the early 1900s. The laws were written specifically and mentioned railroads. There weren't cars and trucks yet. So, wait. Um, Theodore Roosevelt, insurance companies. Insurance companies are overcharging was the major element here. Two or three, they were refusing to pay some damages because that would affect their profit margin, might even put them out of business. Customers had coverage for certain things and they said, no, that's something else, or we're not covering that. You were irresponsible in maintaining the property, or that never would have happened, etc. Those kinds of reasons. And we're not going to cover certain types of damage. So they could say, a tree falls on your house, we don't cover that, with this insurance you're purchasing. Good example is in the early 2000s, there was a massive hurricane that hit the South. Lots of wind damage, and that was covered. Water damage was not covered in insurance policies because they thought, there's a lot of flooding. We're not even going to begin to try to cover that. And now a hurricane came through and caused a lot of wind damage. The insurance companies were saying, we're going to go out of business. That's it. I mean, we can't pay this. George W. Bush mentioned in the open, he said, it's all water damage. So the insurance companies didn't pay much for this huge hurricane that came through there. They said none of the damage was the result of the hurricanes. It was the result of water damage. Roosevelt, he wanted to start a National Bureau of Insurance to control insurance companies, but the bills failed in Congress. So insurance companies were not regulated as were the meat and railroad industries. Supreme Court, Standard Oil. This is a 1911 case. It's 2 years after Roosevelt left office, but it's part of his legacy. One of two major items. Standard Oil had created a monopoly. You can't do that, according to this Supreme Court decision. And then they further said, you got to break the company up. So they break it up. Now, they formed 30 new companies, and they include, it's remarkable, the names of the top companies: Mobil, Exxon, Continental, Atlantic, Chevron, Phillips, Marathon, Conoco, plus 20 more or so smaller companies that many of us have never heard of, are created by Standard Oil. So it's still a monopoly. Instead of owning one company and doing all of this, they now own 30 companies. They maintain the Standard Oil name in many states. This was a lawsuit that got to the Supreme Court, but specifically mentioned the state of New Jersey only. So Standard Oil in New Jersey disappeared, but in other states, they maintained the name. So many companies agreed to these regulations, these oil companies, and they did so to avoid future lawsuits. Sound familiar? Lots of law companies that are signing agreements with the Trump administration today so that they aren't sued, or happening again in 2025. The big difference here, in Theodore Roosevelt's day, his motive was for the greater good. Donald Trump's motive certainly appears that it's protection for the wealthy. Most agree that these agreements with law companies in particular are part of the agreement is you won't sue him for any reason. The Antiquities Act of 1906. This was during the Roosevelt administration. This was the first act of Congress in the United States that protected natural resources, cultural heritage, scientific lands, and historic places. Let's take a look at some of this. The president, by proclamation, this law says, can protect significant areas. So you can write a presidential proclamation and it protects 40 acres someplace because they are an original forest. It never got cut down. It's virgin forest land, etc. Anything like that. This has been used by presidents about once a year in the last 120 years. So we've had about 120 such proclamations since this law was passed. National monuments may be constructed on federal lands as part of this Antiquities Act. So here's the Washington Monument, for instance. In the background, there you can see the dome. That's the Capitol building. To our left, to our left is the White House. Historic sites are protected for archaeological examination, and only professionals can excavate in those areas. I mean, today the number of people with a metal detector and they're out, but has the area been designated, is an issue. Four of the fifth element, or the fourth element of 5 in this Antiquities Act is the president can create national parks. This is a much quicker process than having to go through Congress. It could take years. There could be people opposed to it. In Congress, you'd have people saying, hey, we want 6 national parks in our state. We want it to be these areas, hoping that it would increase tourism and benefit lots of businesses around those sites. And so the prospect of corruption was part of this. But at any rate, the president gets to create national parks. It saves an area immediately. It doesn't take 5 years or 2 years to get through Congress and then be looked at and built up. Here is a map of national parks. Alaska down here. Look at Alaska. It's got 8 national parks. Almost nobody lives there. Look at Minnesota. We got 1. Voyageurs National Park. We have 5.5 million people in this state. I think Alaska, I'm not sure what their population is. I think it might be less than 1 million, but anyway. The fifth element of this act, no hunting, fishing, or grazing on protected lands. So these lands that are protected, you stay off of them. You have to stay off of them. Theodore Roosevelt, again, the Inland Waterways Commission of 1907. It's not an act of Congress, but it's a group that was created by Theodore Roosevelt, and it dealt with transportation on rivers and on lakes. Now, railroads are gigantic, but despite their size, they couldn't meet the demands of shipping at the time. So that's why this Shipping on Waterways Act or Commission was created. Part of the problem was solved by using river transportation. As a kid, I used to go over to the lock and dams by the Ford plant, look down from way up above, watch river traffic. They're using the locks and huge barges full of goods, etc. Conference of Governors in 1908. State governors were called together by Roosevelt, and he wanted to talk to them about getting more involved in conservation. Here's Roosevelt sitting in the middle. These are all governors, or an aide or two might be in there, but he called this conference. There were 46 states at the time. State governors started meeting. They said, hey, let's do this regularly. Now in 2025, they meet twice a year. Here's a photo of one of their meetings and the governors who attended. This is Abbott of Texas, who uses a wheelchair. The National Conservation Commission, created in 1908. Another Theodore Roosevelt edition. And it's made up of members of Congress. We're going to talk about three elements of it. It dealt with forest, lands, minerals, and water. So natural resources. Natural resources, what are they? Looking left to right here, it's animals, air and land, metals, ore, forests, fossil fuels, and water. Okay, item 3 of this is Canada and Newfoundland, which wasn't a part of Canada yet, and Mexico were included in the meetings about conservation. In 2025, would such a meeting be allowed? Or we're not talking about meetings with some of these countries. We're talking about making them states. How did Theodore Roosevelt see this inventory of things that he wanted to preserve? Well, he set up resources about what you could do. So when you cut down trees, you have to replant trees. Here's 2 views about the commission that we're going to look at. In Minnesota, it took about 75 years, starting in the south, moving northward, and cutting down the forest areas. 90% of all trees were cut down in this 75-year effort by corporations making lumber. Had they started replanting 75 years earlier, as they cleared an area, by the time they had gotten to the north of Minnesota and run out of stuff to cut down, they would have had 75-year-old trees again back down in the south. Such conservation or replenishment was never done. Roosevelt was very much in favor of this. So they'd have had a new crop ready. It didn't exist. Then there's a lot of stuff they can't use. Side pieces that are mostly bark once they cut it into lumber. All the branches were unusable. They just left that stuff laying there as they moved northward. This stuff dried out and became a gigantic fire hazard. And there were a couple of fires up near Duluth, or on the way to Duluth, about halfway to Duluth is Hinckley on 35. You can stop there. They have a forest fire museum. You stop and you drive 10 blocks maybe to this museum once you're off the freeway. The Hinckley Fire, 1894, 418 dead. You can drive up there in maybe an hour and look at some stuff in Hinckley. It's an interesting place. Then turn around and come back. It's a nice little day trip. Up by Duluth, you got the Cloquet Moose Lake Fire of 1918, caused by all this dead branch stuff that was left behind. 453 deaths in that fire. Second item concerning this commission is conservationists wanted it to be about preservation. You don't cut down trees and replant them. You leave it alone. Let nature take care of it. This is a picture of John Muir sitting in a bog area on a rock. He's the founder of the Sierra Club. It was an active and gigantic voice during this period of time when Roosevelt was president, arguing for conservation, not for replanting. He supported preservation. On the left is a photo of him with Theodore Roosevelt, and on the right, just a photo of his profiled head. But a very famous fellow. Sierra clubs all around. You can attend their meetings. You can look this group up on Google. Labor dispute, 1901 to 1902. Teddy Roosevelt wasn't much interested in labor. He thought it's way too controversial an issue. And you're dealing with management, you're dealing with labor, and it could become a major problem. So let's just pretend it doesn't exist. However, in the 1890s, you had a tremendous rise in union membership. So in the early 1900s, when Roosevelt is president, it is indeed an issue. The membership of unions had doubled during that period of time. The United Mine Workers included soft coal and hard coal. Now, soft coal mines were very dangerous because that could easily cave in. Hard coal mines, it's a harder product. These guys became members later because there weren't as many accidents in hard coal mines as there are in soft coal mines. You want an iron mine like Tower Sudan mine that I mentioned down here. Tower Sudan mine. You go into those tunnels down there. I mean, there's never a collapse. This is hard ore down here. It's iron ore. And so some types of mines are very safe. Some are very dangerous. I would tell you, you go up to Duluth and then drive even further north, not along the river or the Lake Superior, but inland. Go to the Tower Sudan mine. Heck of a trip. You get in an elevator there and you go 2,300 feet down to get to the mine. That's 230 stories. There's no building in the world that tall. It is a heck of a ride. And then you get off down there and it's just gigantic, huge caverns. They could carve out a tremendous amount of material down in those levels because they were dealing with a very hard substance, iron, taking it out. The University of Minnesota also has a research project that they do there. You get a tour of that and you get a tour of the mine, and then it's back up again, 2,300 feet. Just an amazing, interesting trip. And it's summertime, time to do it. 1902, a strike begins, and there's two demands on the strike from these coal companies in particular. They want an 8-hour workday. They were currently at a 10-hour workday, and they wanted pay increases. And this is a poster from the period. 8 hours of work, 8 hours for rest, sleep, and 8 hours for doing what you want. That's how you can divide up the day. So the strike begins. The owners of the mines refuse to talk to the unions. They go, the heck with you. Well, pretty soon the mine owners are really losing money. So they're getting concerned, wondering what to do. Teddy Roosevelt intervenes and he says, come to the White House, bring union leaders, bring business leaders, and Roosevelt attends the meeting, and they reach 3 agreements. Number one, pay increases granted. The unions were demanding a 20% increase. They got 10%. Both coal and steel industries had been paying in scrip. Now, what this is they didn't pay in US dollars. They paid you in money printed by their company. And you could only use it in their company-owned businesses. So in the towns around their mines, there was a grocery store. It was owned by the company. Prices were outrageous. You had money that was printed by the company. You could only spend it at the company businesses. So you get rid of that, hopefully, but it did continue to some extent. 2 or 3. The workday was reduced from 10 hours to 9. So a slight reduction. They wanted a 2-hour reduction. Number 3, unions will not be recognized as official organizations. Nobody, no government agency, no business, nobody can say to a labor union that you're an official organization. After this meeting, Teddy Roosevelt refused all involvement in labor and management disputes, and that lasted the entire remaining 7 years. He just saw this as way too horrible an issue. African-American community. Theodore Roosevelt, African-American community introduction. This is Booker T. Washington. He was the great Black leader of this period of time back at the turn of the century, 1800s to 1900s. Teddy Roosevelt invited him to dinner at the White House. The meeting was not announced until after it had occurred. A Black man invited to dinner at the White House. Lots of people in the public went berserko. They really were outraged by the fact that a Black man was treated in this way. He was the first Black person to dine at the White House, with the exception of slaves who had dined there up until 1865, and servants who were Black who ate there, but in the basement area. Here's a picture of Booker T. Washington and Theodore Roosevelt making a speech together. There's a book on this dinner, currently in print. You can buy it anywhere, but Amazon has it for $13. Guest of Honor by Deborah Davis, and there's a painting of Booker T. Washington and Theodore Roosevelt having this dinner. Consequences. He stayed out of the civil rights issue for the remaining 7 years of his term. Newspapers all across the country talked about this issue and attacked him. He did privately consult with Booker T. Washington. They were people that had telephones, so he could call. So he did ask advice about certain issues. He avoided contacts with people who were supporters of Jim Crow laws. These were anti-Black people laws. They maintained segregation and worse things. I mean, here's a sign, you're entering the colored area, and this young person there at the fountain, you don't step beyond that fountain. You're coming into white territory then. A speech that Roosevelt made about the African-American community. He stated opposition to lynchings, which were very common throughout the United States, but especially in the South. In 90 to 100 years after the Civil War, so the 1950s into the 1960s, a total of 4,000 lynchings occurred, most in the South, about one a week. Although I was writing up about a murder case in Otter Tail County and doing the research in Fergus Falls, and I came across an article about a black man riding a horse through Otter Tail County in 1882. And who are you? What do you think you're doing here? And they lynched the guy. So it happened in Minnesota, but nothing like Mississippi. Actions against blacks. Roosevelt refused to hire blacks to work in the federal government. Whoa. So did Woodrow Wilson. He further fired blacks from federal jobs. Get rid of them. Get them off of the premises. Also, when this got noticed, that he was doing this anti-black stuff, firing people, not hiring people, newspapers started talking about it, especially northern newspapers. And here I've got the header for the Indianapolis Journal, a northern newspaper. But anyway, many of these newspapers across the North were very critical about Roosevelt's policies on race issues. He accused 3 companies of black soldiers of not following his orders and dishonorably discharged all 3 companies. The Panic of 1907 is the next thing we'll talk about. This is businesses versus the presidents. Now, panic, what is that? Well, that was a term that was used from the 1780s up into the 1920s to describe an economic depression. Then we started calling them depressions. So in 1930s, we had the Great Depression. Today, we call them recessions. Now, a lot of people say, no, a recession isn't a depression. It's a smaller decline in the economy. But however you want to define it, we've had 3 terms for these things: panic, depression, recession. Businesses respond. Who can we blame for this downturn, this panic that has occurred in 1907? Well, it's quite obviously these policies of Theodore Roosevelt that have regulated us. Theodore Roosevelt had a response to this, 2 items. Corporations were buying up other corporations. This is a violation of antitrust acts that were passed before he was president even, and nothing is being done about them. And he ended some banking regulations for these companies that were in decline. They could now issue bonds. So you'd sell $100 bond for $94, and in 1 year, or sometimes maybe 5 years, you could come and collect the $100 value of it, even though you only paid $94 for it. So companies could issue bonds. That would bring money into them right now and aid them during this panic or depression. And it allowed federal money to be deposited in private banks. And that would upscale the private banks now. Instead of the federal government holding the money like at Fort Knox, they'd now put it in banks that could use it to make loans, etc. Here's a picture of a bank from that time period. The Aldridge of Vreeland Act of 1908 deals with this panic. Banks can form alliances. That's what they were called in the act. They were trusts. So here you got a law now under the Roosevelt administration that allows trusts to develop, but they're called alliances. And they are limited to 10 banks only. You can't have 11, you can't have 20 banks coming together, but you can form alliances or these trusts for up to 10 banks together. And they can issue currency, just like US currency. And it will be backed by government bonds. here's a government bond, just an image for fun. Second item in this Aldrich-Vreeland Act was National Commission was created, and they investigate and they put out reports on the banking system in the United States. Congress responds to the panic. Out of this particular law, this Aldrich-Vreeland Act, Congress further expanded it and created the Federal Reserve System, which is still in existence today. They have boards of about 15 people. Only one is appointed by the president. The others are all members from corporations generally. But the Federal Reserve System, it has several districts. The headquarters are in Minneapolis for this district. I think we're the 8th district. So Teddy Roosevelt's speech. I'm wondering, how are we doing with questions? Should I stop here now?
We don't have any questions submitted at the moment, so
Okay. Let me go another 5 minutes and
yeah, let's do that.
We'll check back, okay? Teddy Roosevelt's speech. One of 3 items about this speech of his concerning the panic. He was angry about great wealth. You know, hey, this is primarily a problem of the role that gigantic corporations and individuals with huge amounts of money have been responsible for. That's the reason for the economic downturn. Government's not involved very heavily in how you operate. And he says the government may be to blame, but only partially. The problem is corporate policies. The problem is not government regulations. And in his speech, he says, wealth is incapable of governing a country. They do lasting damage. They only think about themselves. So he did a lot of finger pointing in this thing. And it's very interesting in light of 2025 leadership in the United States. Tariffs in particular are an item that raises the price tremendously of foreign goods and makes American-made goods less expensive as a result. But they charge almost up to where the foreign goods coming in would have charged. It's well, it's interesting anyway. And we've gotten away from we've gotten away from tariffs. The last 60 years has been global cooperation and the creating of global economies and global interaction. And there's far less of that now, with lots of American companies still based in the United States, but they do everything in China and then bring it back into the United States. So tariffs, Republican Party. Since its founding, 1854 is when the Republican Party was founded, ran its first presidential candidate in 1856. They have generally supported high tariffs. But Teddy Roosevelt, as president, did not support them. And the Republican Party, as a result, became split on this issue during the Roosevelt administration. Eastern Republicans, along the East Coast, the Atlantic Ocean, that's a big manufacturing area. They supported high tariffs on all products because we want the American-made goods, the U.S.-made goods, to be cheaper and less and more purchased by Americans then. Now, Western Republicans, that was people like from the Mississippi River westward, they were farming. They wanted high tariffs on agricultural goods coming into the U.S., but not on manufactured goods. They wanted low tariffs on manufactured goods. That was stuff they had to buy. So this split the Republican Party. on this issue. Tariffs. Tariffs made large businesses very wealthy. Here's some buildings to make it look big. They also made individuals wealthy. Here's you can see there's Elon Musk. This is Oprah Winfrey. People often don't think of her as one of the super wealthy. Jeff Bezos. And so lots of super wealthies there. Tariffs hurt consumers because they raise the price of goods. This is what the Democratic Party says about it. Further, they say lowering tariffs, however, does decrease the federal income. How can we make up for that decrease? Because those tariffs go in to the federal government, and that's how they make a lot of money. Now they're going to lose money with no tariffs. How do we do that? Create a tax on the rich. There's no income tax yet. So they say start taxing the rich. That occurred under Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft. We started taxing people, and we were taxing only the rich. A lot of that has changed, especially due to lobbying. Hey, we should be able to deduct thus and such and so on. TR's situation on tariffs. He didn't want involvement with tariffs. He didn't like it that it was splitting the Republican Party. He avoided commenting on it. It became a major issue for William Howard Taft, his successor, and it just was a horrible thing for Taft, especially in the 1912 election, which he lost. Benefits of tariffs. They protect U.S. manufacturers from cheaper foreign goods. Foreign good items or foreign items, food items are generally less expensive than American food items. So, interesting question here. We've been talking about manufacturers. We've been talking about big corporations like railroads and so on. What about protecting consumers? Second of four items, wages in the U.S. are higher due to tariffs. Now, U.S. businesses can cut wages to make their products cheaper with no tariffs. This is thinking on kind of both sides of the issue. You're making more money here as a worker because our products are being bought, not foreign products. But we can also cut your wages if you'd like to make products even cheaper. So, 3 of 4, higher wages attract more immigrants to the United States. And this supplies companies with needed employees. So these higher tariffs make for higher wages, make for greater immigration, make for cheaper employees. Interesting kind of cycle there. Taxes on imported goods provided 1/3 of the federal government. So these tariffs were a gigantic piece of the federal government, 1/3 of their money. Conclusions here. Republicans were high tariff people. Tariffs protected large businesses. The Republican Theodore Roosevelt was opposed to high tariffs, but never did anything about it. How are we doing? Any questions now?
We've got about 3 questions, which will take us to 2 o'clock. So let's go ahead and answer those.
Okay. Let me quit here and,
All right. So the first question is Morrill Hall at the University of Minnesota named after the person you spoke of today?
no, I don't think so. There was a person with that name who was a president of the university.
Yes, and that's what I found too. He was the 8th president of the university from 1945 to 1960.
Yeah.
And then the next two questions relate to Roosevelt and Booker T. Washington. So the first one is, how did Roosevelt's treatment of Black workers affect his relationship with Booker T. Washington? And did they continue to meet and talk?
Yeah, well, they didn't continue to meet, but they talked. Well, I guess that's a meeting, but at any rate, yes, they continue. Roosevelt continued getting advice from Booker T. Washington. It was done quietly, backroom stuff, and he really appreciated the movement for greater rights for Black people and so on. So yes, they did have contact with each other, and Roosevelt was supportive of this, but did nothing about it. 1909, his last year as president, was the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, founded by some Blacks and some whites. And that's today is the NAACP. I set up a museum for Roy Wilkins, who was born in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was graduated from a St. Paul high school, graduated from the University of Minnesota, and was president of the NAACP in New York City. He had died at the time I was setting up that museum, but his wife was still alive. I spent a good deal of time with her. I'd go out to New York City. She lived in the Bronx, and I'd go to her home, and she'd come to the university, and we would talk. And so Minnesota has quite a connection with the NAACP, especially during the Civil Rights Movement. He was as famous as Martin Luther King Jr. was, and I mean, I have to explain to people who he was nowadays. They don't remember the name, but he was heavily involved in the civil rights movement. So anyway, Teddy Roosevelt kept quiet, but kept himself informed.
And maybe this next question relates to it about why did he invite Booker T. Washington to the White House?
Well, he wanted to start civil rights movement. He wanted to give it some attention. He was concerned about it. And the whole thing went very negative. The general public was very negative about it, even in the North, in many cases. And the press, I mean, it just became a gigantic issue nationwide in the press. In the South, just very damning to Theodore Roosevelt. And so he backed off from it. But he was interested in, his speech about the lynchings he talked about and so on. This was another major element of attempting to get some involvement and changes made in civil rights, but it came to nothing.
Yeah, great. Let's see. We have one last question, and then we'll wrap up. If Roosevelt wanted to start a civil rights movement, why did he dishonorably discharge Blacks from the armed forces? It's almost sort of like a hypocrisy there.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't want these Black people working in the federal government. He fired many. He refused to hire any. And then got rid of those federal troops. And, this made him look good publicly to people who were, he wanted to look rational. Well, I'm looking at both sides of this stuff, and I'm getting these people out of the federal government and so on. So it was an attempt to balance the view and win more support from people who were anti-Black and segregationist and so on. And Woodrow Wilson was from the South. Woodrow Wilson got elected, and he immediately made we want a list of every black person working for the federal government, and he started firing even more than Roosevelt did. Yeah, so it was quite an issue then, and you had a couple of presidents there over a 20-year period who really tried to undo any talk about civil rights. And of course, the NAACP had been founded. There were groups talking about the rights of Black people, and these presidents were trying to basically maintain segregation, including in the workplace.
Interesting.
Now,
Well, that is all the time we have for today. Thanks everybody for joining us for this third session of Teddy Roosevelt. We'll be back next Wednesday at the same time for the fourth session. So we'll see you then.